which you, my God, have created.
Their own money anymore. But we have letters from these people. Mechthild talks about writing 7 books. Mechthild of Magdeburg, who's probably one of the best known commonly of the Beguines, but we know it as one book. It's just that they didn't have a concept of sitting down and creating an outline and writing this whole book and editing it and re-editing it and then publishing it. It's just she would send these pamphlets out to people to share with their beguinages. Mechthild was the magistra of her community in Magdeburg. In her later years, as her health is beginning to fail, and the Inquisition is after her because she was condemning corruption amongst the clergy. She referred to them as smelly goats. She ended up going to Helfta, which is a Benedictine monastery of quite renown of its own, and she spent her last years there with them, partly because of her poor health, partly because she was going blind. But she wrapped up the second half of her 6th book and her 7th book, The Flowing Light of the Godhead, which is a series of poems. It's letters of encouragement, letters of condemnation, visions that she's had, teachings so it's a kind of a mishmash, but a lovely mishmash of her writings over the years. So you kind of get a sense of her progression in her inner world as a woman of that time. We have letters from really quite a number of people. Hadewig of Brabant was a Beguine in the Flemish countries. We don't know exactly when she was born or when she died, but she left behind a large body of poetry and some letters. We don't think she was a magistra because we think she traveled around some. And that was not unusual. You might still be a member of this particular Beguine community, but that doesn't mean you didn't go out with a pair and go on kind of a preaching tour. But we think that Hadewig was born into aristocracy, that she grew up in a court, because she had a real familiarity with courtly love poetry, and it's not something most people today would really latch onto and say this is, very enlightening, but it was of its era. I guess today they'd be rapping or something like that, hip hop, as their form of expressing their teachings. But she's considered to be one of the best writers of courtly love poetry of her era, and she wrote in Middle Dutch. Again, kind of unusual. They know she knew Latin, the Church Ecclesia Latin, but she wrote in Middle Dutch because she was trying to reach a larger audience. And so if you're into poetry, she would be someone you might want to look up and read some of her writings there. We have a Beguine by the name of Marguerite Porret. She wrote a book called Mirror of Simple Souls. Marguerite will end up being burned at the stake in 1310. But it wasn't just about her. She was in prison for a couple of years because she wrote this book. Again, this is a progression. It was burned publicly by the bishop in Cambrai. She already had another copy. She added some more chapters, was spreading it around to people. We know this because copies showed up in archives all over Europe in different languages. So she was quite popular in her day. Again, it was burned. She was ordered never to talk about it or to share copies. She added on some more to it. She kept preaching around Europe. She gets swept up into the French king's jail. She refused, in the 2 years she was down in his jail, to respond to any of his jailers, claiming that she was a citizen of the Holy Roman Empire and only the emperor could question her for whether she was a heretic or not. Only he had the right to put her on trial. She refused to acknowledge the authority of the French king. So she's down there for 2 years. She's refusing to answer their questions about her book, whether it's heretical or not, why she taught this, why she taught that. But then one day the French king gets upset with the Templars who are down in the south because he wants their money and they won't give it up to him. The Jews won't turn over all their wealth to him. He obviously was conducting wars he couldn't afford. So he just basically orders the whole prison to be emptied out and everyone was executed May 1st, 1310, and she gets swept up into that. Now, why is her book controversial? She said, like the others, they're quite pastoral. All of these women whose writings survived really pay attention to what does it mean to grow in spirituality? What does it mean to deepen your inner life? What does it mean to expand your prayer life? who is God? What are healthy images for God? It's not just God the Father. There's all these other wonderful images that Beguines use, as that Marguerite did. So hers, like the others, are writing very pastorally. This is how I pray. This is how I deepen. This is what I've come to understand about who God is. But she goes a little bit farther because she says it is possible to become so close to God that you don't need the church's sacraments anymore. Well, that is what they objected to, because sacraments are big business, and I control them as the Pope, the bishop, the whatever. I control them. I decide who gets access and who does not. And you've just gone and said, we're not needed. Well, she's not really denigrating sacraments. That's where they misread. She's just saying it is possible for a person to draw so close to God that the sacraments are kind of meaningless now. And that was what they hauled her in for an investigation for heresy. Interesting side note, her book continues to spread after she dies, but her name falls off the title page, if there's a title page. And it's written by, they start saying it was written by an anonymous man. And for several hundred years, it was quite the hit. And then, like anything with the Enlightenment, it kind of gets put to the back of the library and is forgotten. And it is only in 1946 that an Italian woman scholar proves once and for all that the book they said was perfectly fine, written by this anonymous male, was actually the book that Marguerite Porete died for. She finally got resurrected and brought back into the fold. Like Catherine of Siena wrote a book called The Dialogue. Mechtilde Magdeburg has portions that are dialogue. There are a number of others. I don't have to go through the whole list. But they would write a dialogue. Like for Marguerite, it was three people, the reason, the soul, and the spirit. For some of the others, like Catherine of Siena, it's the soul and God having a conversation with each other. Now, it was not meant to be read in private. It was not meant for you to sit in a corner with a good cup of tea and start reading this dialogue. It'd be pretty dry. It's kind of like, I hate to say this, try reading Shakespeare today. You're meant to witness Shakespeare being performed on a stage, not sit there and read the pages. My apologies to all the English professors who teach Shakespeare, but the dialogues were meant to be performed. And so she writes this dialogue, let's just say Catherine of Siena writes this dialogue, but she and another woman, or just two women, would take each of the parts in the marketplace and start performing this back and forth, having this conversation as a way of teaching the people. Again, that's always the goal, never to be read just in private. That's a very modern concept. As you know, in the Rule of Benedict, when Benedict says, when you're reading, when you're doing your Lectio, don't disturb your neighbors. It's not because you might hit the table or, drop a cup of tea. It's because people read orally. And so Benedict wanted you to read, but soften it down so you're not disturbing your neighbor, who might be reading something different. That was true during the season of the Beguines. We were still reading orally. It really is only a very modern concept, like maybe the later 1700s, 1800s, when people started reading in private, probably with the increase of philosophy and novels, but it's not during this time. It would have been done orally. And let me see here. Catherine of Siena has a great saying, and it's a saying that you sometimes see in a different form on, at least in the United States, on greeting cards and that sort of thing. And what she says is, be who God meant you to be, and you will set the whole world on fire. I think that's so lovely. Catherine, as you may know, reached a certain point where she started going on preaching ministries. She began by walking to Avignon in southern France and somehow made it into the papal court. Of course, you can't do this today, but then I guess it was more fluid. And she went into the papal court and she found the Pope on his throne, and she told him she'd had a dream. And, Your Holiness, you either return to Rome or you're going to burn in hell forever. And something about her, he packed up and he returned to Rome. There's certain forcefulness of her personality and a certain integrity to her words convinced clerics that when she spoke to them, she meant what she said. Now, several times he was inching towards returning to France under the control and protection of the French king. And each time she traveled down to Rome and she would convince the Pope Nope, you've got to stay. Now, hell is very real. And you know your Dante Alighieri and the Divine Comedy. And that's a great book if you haven't read it. So you've got kings and bishops and popes burning in the deepest depths of hell, and it's levels of hell down to the worst. And then you have purgatory with people who are going to pass through eventually to the other side. And by God in heaven, Dante placed prostitutes and courtesans up in heaven, because they were basically known for being more generous to the poor than other people were, because they know what it's like to be there. And so this was enriching the imagination of the people at this time. So when the Beguines talked about hell or purgatory in their visions, and visions were always meant to be preached and taught, people actually literally believed them, because they did live with the fear of hell. And when there was interdict, Hildegard was not the only one who buried people in consecrated ground. The Beguines became known as funeral specialists. And it's kind of like death doulas or hospices today, where a person would reach out to the Beguines, and two would agree to accompany this person by sitting with them in their last days, praying with them, making sure they get water, whatever. When the person passes, they've promised they're going to follow you all the way to consecrated ground. So they wash the body, wrap it in a shroud. Coffins were mostly just for temporary use. They would accompany, pray the office of the dead, accompany the coffin to consecrated ground, even though technically they're not supposed to be burying anyone there. They would always find some place, and would see that the body was properly buried in consecrated ground and buried, covered over, because they lived with a belief in those days that if you died and were buried in unconsecrated ground, you would burn in hell forever. It did not matter how holy your life was, how good a person you were. They truly believed that you had to be buried in consecrated ground in order to go to heaven, which I hope we have truly gotten over. But anyway, funeral specialists, and they were theologians of purgatory. And there's several of them, Lutgard and a few others, who had very vivid descriptions of who they saw in hell and who they saw in purgatory. And they would decide that, the fishmonger's wife was a good woman. She just made a few mistakes. And so, this is what they'd see in people. So I started praying for Marguerite, let's say, to move out of purgatory into heaven. I watched her go through, and I watched her enter the pearly gates, and she's all fine now.